Crabs. Around midday, with the level of the water edging ever higher, it was clear that the dolphins had begun to disperse. Pia's last set of sightings was of the newborn and its mother, and they put on a display the like of which she had rarely seen. First, there was a series of surfacings in which they exposed almost the entire length of their bodies. The calf was seen to be about a meter in length, while the older animal was almost half as large again. Next, she was afforded a couple of beautiful sightings in which they shot water from their mouths, creating fountains in the air. A spitting behavior of this kind was a characteristic of the species. She believed the dolphins used it as a strategy to confuse their prey. The sightings were so good that she put away her data sheets and picked up her camera. Minutes later, she was rewarded with a rare view of a young orchilla tossing a fish into the air and catching it in its mouth. The propensity to play with prey was a family trait. Orchilla shared it with its relative, the killer whale, but Pia had witnessed it just some 6 times in all her years of tracking orchilla, and this was the only occasion on which she got a clear shot of it. Shortly afterwards the pair vanished. Now it remained to be seen whether they would come back when the water ebbed again in the evening. While Pia was in the bow, watching the water, Fokir and Tutu were sitting in the stern, patiently tending a set of fishing lines. The lines had worried Pia at first, for dolphins had been known to get themselves tangled in certain kinds of fishing gear. But a close look had shown that Fokir's tackle was too flimsy to pose a threat to animals of that size, and she had let the matter pass, deciding that it was all right to ignore such lightweight lines. The fish evidently had come to the same conclusion, for neither father nor son had a single strike all morning. But this didn't seem to worry them. They seemed content where they were, at least for the time being. But when would Fakir and Tutu demand to leave? The night before she had hoped they would set off at first light, but the dolphins had changed everything. She saw now that it was imperative that she stay till the next day. This was the only way she could discover whether there was any truth to her intuition that these dolphins had adapted their behavior to suit the ebb and flow of the water, by staying here through a whole cycle of tides. It was possible, of course, that this was just a fantasy, and in any event it would take years to gather the supportive data. For now, all she needed was a few more shreds of evidence, a few indications to suggest that she was thinking along the right lines. If only she could remain here till the next sunrise, that would be enough. As the hours passed, Pia's anxieties shifted focus, moving away from the dolphins and settling on Fokir and the boy. How much longer before they grew impatient and demanded to leave? What would she have to do to persuade them to remain here? She had noticed that their clay stove had not been lit all morning. They had eaten nothing but some dry chapatis. This was not a good sign. It could mean they were running low on supplies. In other circumstances, she might have offered Fokir a bonus as compensation for whatever inconvenience he might have to suffer. But this was not an option here. The child could not be expected to defer his hunger in order to earn money for his father. Her own supply of water was running low, but she knew she could make it last. It was the two of them she was worried about, and her anxiety prompted her to do something unprecedented. Digging into her carefully hoarded stock of nutrition bars, she offered them some. Fokir declined, but Tutul accepted one and ate it with evident relish. This reassured her a little. If need be, she would sacrifice a few more bars. It would be well worth it if she could only persuade them to stay on. But her nerves would not be quieted. Even as she was filling her data sheets, she kept casting glances in their direction. Their every movement made her start. Was this it? Had they decided to leave now? Unaccountably, nothing happened. Neither of them seemed to have any interest in getting the boat underway. After a meager midday meal of chapatis and honey, they both lay down in the shade of the shelter. Pia was now in a state of such anxiety and expectation that she knew she would not be able to sit still and wait for the hours to pass. Instead, she decided to spend the rest of the afternoon mapping the riverbed to see whether or not there was an underwater pool where the orchella had gathered. She had some experience of this kind of mapping and knew it to be a simple, if painstaking task. It would require her to take the depth soundings that could be linked together to create contour lines. Thanks to the global positioning system, it was easy to ensure the exact placement of each sounding so that the readings were taken along regular geometrical quadrants. But how could she explain this to Fokir? She made her way to the shelter and found Fokir and the boy fast asleep. They were lying on their sides, with Toodle's small form nested inside the larger curve of his father's body. The boy, she noticed, had a slight pudginess that contrasted sharply with his father's near skeletal leanness. Fokir was all muscle and bone, a male anatomy reduced to its essentials. Was the boy better fed than his father? There was a story here that she wished to understand. Who looked after the boy? Did someone have to deprive himself to make sure Tutul was properly fed? Their chests were moving in unison as they slept, and the rhythm of their breathing reminded her of the pair of dolphins she had been watching earlier. It calmed her to see them sleeping so peacefully. The contrast with her own state of mind could not have been more marked. She hesitated in extending her arm to wake Fokir. Would he be annoyed at being woken from his siesta? Was this when he would demand to leave for home? She noticed a bead of sweat traveling down his temple towards the corner of his eye, and without thinking, she put out a finger to flick it away. He woke instantly and sat up, rubbing the spot where her finger had touched his skin. She backed away in embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean—" He shrugged indifferently and dug his fist into his eyes as though he were trying to rub away the remnants of his sleep. "Look." She thrust her positioning monitor in front of him and pointed to the screen. "Over here." To her surprise, his attention was caught immediately. He looked closely as she tried to show him the meaning of the dots and the lines. The hardest part was to explain the correspondence between their own position and their place on the screen. She tried pointing in various combinations to the screen, to herself, and to him and the boy. But the purpose was not served. She saw he had grown flustered and realized that her gestures had given him the impression that she wanted him to move closer to her. The misunderstanding disconcerted her, and she fetched a sheet of paper, deciding on a change in strategy. Surely it would be easier if she reduced the problem to 2 dimensions by drawing a simple diagram with stick figures like those familiar to every child. The trouble was, she had never been much good at drawing, and now halfway into the sketch she was brought up short by an unanticipated misgiving. In the past, she had always used a triangular skirt to distinguish her stick women from her men. But this didn't quite make sense in a situation where the man was in a lungi and the woman in pants. She crumpled up the sheet and would have tossed it away if Fokir hadn't taken it from her hands to save for kindling. With her next drawing, she started with the outlines of the landscape, sketching in the curve of the shore before indicating their own position. Just as she had thought, the reduction to 2 dimensions made all the difference. Once she had shown him how the diagram corresponded with the lines of the monitor screen, the rest was easy. It took only a few strokes of her pencil to convey that she needed him to row the boat in parallel lines over a quadrant shaped roughly like a triangle, with its apex almost touching the far shore. She had expected some reluctance and possibly even resistance, but there was none. On the contrary, he seemed quite pleased and went so far as to rouse Tutul with a cheerful shout. It was the prospect of traversing the water in straight lines that seemed to enthuse him most, and she discovered why when he pulled a roll of line out of the hold. Evidently, he wanted to use this opportunity to do some fishing. But the line puzzled her. In all the time she had spent on Asian rivers, she had never seen its like. It was made of thick, strong nylon, and all along its length, at intervals of a meter or so, were weights, small fragments of broken tile. Stranger still, there were no hooks. Instead, spaced between the weights were bits of fish bone and dried cartilage tied to the line with cord. It was difficult to see how the tackle worked. The expectation seemed to be that a fish would just attach itself to the line and permit itself to be reeled in. But no fish would do that, surely. Then, what could he be fishing for? She was at a loss for an answer. It was clear in any event that the line presented no threat to the dolphins, and she could see no reason to object to his laying it so long as the boat kept to the right course. She went back to the bow and readied herself to proceed with her mapping. With her monitor in hand, she directed Fokir to the position from which they were to start. Then, just as Tutul was dropping the first weight in the water, she dipped the echo sounder and pressed the button. The initial run was about a kilometer long, and by the time they reached the end, the whole line had been paid out. It was after they had turned to retrace their course that Pia discovered what the line was for. It was pulled in with live crab hanging on to every 9th or 10th morsel of bait. The creatures had snapped their claws on the cartilage and would not let go. Fokir and Tutul had only to peel them off with a net and drop them into a pot filled with leaves. The sight made Pia laugh. So this was where the word crabby came from. A creature so stubborn that it would rather be captured than let go. It took only a few more runs to confirm Pia's guess that the dolphins had congregated in a declivity. Her soundings showed that the riverbed dipped by a good 5 to 8 meters there, more than enough to provide for the dolphins' comfort when the water was running low. But it was not just for the dolphins that the pool was a hospitable habitat. Crabs too seemed to flourish there, and Fokir's catch grew steadily with each successive run. At the start, she had thought they might end up disrupting each other's work, that her soundings would get in the way of his fishing or the other way around. But to her surprise, no such difficulties arose. The stops required for the laying of the line seemed to be ideally timed for the taking of soundings. What was more, the line acted like a guide rail, keeping the boat on a straight and unvarying tack, and at the end of each run it led them right back to the precise starting point. In other circumstances, Pia would have had to use the global positioning system to be sure of this, but here the line served the same purpose. She needed her monitor only to make sure that each run began at a point 5 meters farther along the quadrant. This was just as much to Fokir's advantage as it was to hers, since it ensured that his line never fell twice in the same place. It was surprising enough that their jobs had not proved to be utterly incompatible, especially considering that one of the tasks required the input of geostationary satellites, while the other depended on bits of shark bone and broken tile. But that it had proved possible for two such different people to pursue their own ends simultaneously, people who could not exchange a word with each other and had no idea of what was going on in one another's heads, was far more surprising. It seemed almost miraculous, nor was she the only one to remark on this. Once, when her glance happened accidentally to cross Fokir's, she saw something in his expression that told her that he too was amazed by the seamless intertwining of their pleasures and their purposes. When the crab pot was full, Fokir covered its mouth with an aluminum plate and passed it to her so she could release the catch into the hold. Looking in, she saw that there were some 15 crabs inside the pot, eyeing her balefully, snapping their claws. When she tipped the pot over, they tumbled out in a chain and disappeared into a hold with an angry outburst of clicking and clattering. The unlikely eloquence of the sound drew a laugh from Pia. Her birthday was in July, and she had often wondered why the ancients had included a crab in the zodiac, when there were so many other more interesting animals to choose from. But now, as she watched the creatures scuttling about in the hold, she found herself wishing that she knew more about crabs. She recalled a class in which the teacher had demonstrated how some kinds of a crab actually laundered the mud they lived in, scrubbing it grain by grain. Their feet and their sides were lined with hairs that formed microscopic brushes and spoons. They used these to scrape off the diatoms and other edible matter attached to each grain of sand. There were a sanitation department and a janitorial team rolled into one. They kept the mangroves alive by removing their leaves and litter. Without them, the trees would choke on their own debris. Didn't they represent some fantastically large proportion of the system's biomass? Didn't they outweigh even the trees and the leaves? Hadn't someone said that the intertidal forests should be named after crabs rather than mangroves, since it was they, certainly not the crocodile or the tiger or the dolphin, who were the keystone species of the entire ecosystem? She had thought of these concepts, keystone species, biomass, as ideas that applied to things other than herself, to nature in short, for who was it who had said that the definition of nature was that it included everything not formed by human intention? But it was not her own intention that had brought her here today. It was the crabs, because they were Fokir's livelihood, and without them he would not have known to lead her to this pool where the Orkella came. Maybe the ancients had it right after all. Perhaps it was the crab that ruled the tide of her destiny.